Al Capone sat in a private dining room at the Lexington Hotel in Chicago, his headquarters, his fortress, the place where he conducted business. Ought would determine the fate of organized crime across America, waiting for a meeting that should never have been possible, that violated every rule of how the criminal underworld was supposed to operate. And that would remain secret for decades because revealing it would have destroyed the carefully maintained racial barriers that both legitimate society and the criminal world depended upon to function. Capone was at the height of his power, controlled bootlegging operations generating over $100 million annually, and had just survived the bloodiest year of the Prohibition-era gang wars, and he eliminated most serious rivals through violence that had made him simultaneously the most powerful and the most hunted gangster in American history. But Capone faced a problem that couldn't be solved through violence, a threat that was growing in ways he hadn't anticipated, and that required a solution so unconventional that when his advisors had first suggested it, Capone had laughed and said, "You want me to make a deal with a colored gangster? Are you insane?" The man Capone was waiting for was Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson, a Harlem numbers racketeer who'd been sent to Chicago by Stephanie St. Clair, the legendary Madame Queen who controlled Harlem's policy gambling operations and who was facing pressure from Italian mobsters who wanted to take over her lucrative territory. Johnson had arrived in Chicago, carrying a proposition that was audacious to the point of being suicidal. Harlem's black gangsters wanted to make a deal with Al Capone, wanted to negotiate a division of criminal territories along racial lines, wanted to establish rules that would prevent the turf wars that were destroying both organizations' profits and attracting unwanted federal attention. The proposition was extraordinary because it violated the fundamental assumption of American organized crime that white gangsters controlled everything, and that black gangsters operated in the margins with whatever scraps the white bosses allowed them to have. But what happened in that hotel dining room over the next 3 hours would establish a secret arrangement that would govern American organized crime for the next 40 years. Would create an understanding between white and black criminal organizations that was so effective and so profitable that both sides would protect the secret even from their own organizations, and would demonstrate that Al Capone's greatest talent wasn't violence, but was recognizing when cooperation was more profitable than conflict, even when that cooperation violated every social norm of segregated America. This narrative explores how Bumpy Johnson came to Chicago as an emissary from Harlem's black gangsters, how Al Capone recognized at fighting over Harlem's territory would be more costly than sharing it, how the two men negotiated an arrangement that gave black gangsters autonomy in their territories in exchange for paying tribute to Italian organizations and agreeing not to expand into white-controlled areas, how this secret alliance created stability that both sides profited from enormously, and how the partnership between Capone and Johnson, one that couldn't be publicly acknowledged because it would outrage both white society that demanded segregation and black communities that resented any suggestion that black gangsters were subordinate to white criminals, shaped American organized crime in ways that historians are only beginning to understand now that both men are long dead and the secrets they protected can finally be told. The Lexington Hotel on South Michigan Avenue in Chicago was Al Capone's domain. Every employee was on his payroll. Every room could be transformed into a fortress or an escape route. Every person who entered was observed and evaluated for threats. Security around Capone had been intensified after multiple assassination attempts after rivals had tried to kill him with bombs and bullets, after Capone had learned that being the most powerful gangster in Chicago also made him the most hunted. So when Bumpy Johnson walked into the Lexington Hotel, he was taking an extraordinary risk. Johnson was a black man entering a white gangster's headquarters in an era when racial segregation was absolute. When most Chicago establishments wouldn't serve black customers, when SH, owing up at Al Capone's hotel uninvited would normally result in being beaten or killed rather than being granted an audience. But Johnson wasn't uninvited. He'd been expected, had been granted. Safe passage had been told by Capone's representatives that he could come to Chicago to present his proposition, and that he'd be allowed to leave alive regardless of whether Capone accepted. Diego rejected the deal. Johnson was escorted through the hotel by two of Capone's bodyguards, large Italian men who said nothing, but who watched Johnson carefully, looking for any sign he might be armed or might be planning an attack. Johnson had been searched twice already, and he carried no weapons, wore a simple, expensive suit that marked him as someone with money and maintained the calm expression of a man who understood. He was completely at the mercy of people who could kill him at any moment, but who believed the potential rewards justified the risk. The private dining room where Capone waited was on the hotel's fourth floor, was furnished expensively with mahogany furniture and crystal chandeliers, and had food laid out on a table, Italian dishes, expensive wines, the kind of spread that Capone used to demonstrate his wealth and his hospitality. Capone sat at the head of the table, wore one of his signature custom suits that cost more than most of them, and earned in a year, and was flanked by two of his top advisors, Jake Greasy Thumb Guzik, Capone's financial manager and the man who handled the organization's relationships with corrupt politicians and police, and Frank Nitti, Capone's enforcer, and the man who handled problems that required violence. Mr. Johnson, Capone said, standing to shake hands, a gesture of respect that shocked Johns on because most white men wouldn't shake hands with black men regardless of the circumstances. Welcome to Chicago. Please sit, eat. We're not going to do business on empty stomachs. Johnson sat carefully, maintaining the respectful, but not submissive, demeanor that was essential for this meeting. He needed to show respect for Capone's power without appearing weak, needed to demonstrate that Harlem's black gangsters were serious players worthy of negotiating with rather than being dismissed as minor criminals who could be ignored or crushed. Mr. Capone Johnson began, his voice steady despite, and understanding that the next few minutes would determine whether he left this room alive or whether he became another body in the Chicago River. I appreciate you agreeing to meet with me, Madame. St. Clair sends her respects and asks me to present a proposition that she believes will benefit both your organization and ours. Capone poured wine, offered a glass to Johnson, and smiled in OT, the friendly smile of someone greeting a friend, but the calculating smile of a businessman evaluating a potential deal. I'm listening, but I got to tell you, when my people first told me Harlem wanted to send someone to negotiate, I thought it was a joke. You understand what you're asking for. You're asking me, Al Capone, who controls Chicago, who's got agreements with every major family from New York to Kansas City to Mega, deal with colored gangsters. You know how that looks. I understand exactly how it looks, Johnson said, meeting Capone's eyes directly, not backing. G down, it looks like you're smart enough too. Recognize when cooperation is more profitable than conflict. It looks like you understand that fighting over Harlem is going to cost you more money than you'll ever make from taking it over. And it looks like you're the one boss in this country who's got the balls to do what makes business sense, even when it goes against what everybody expects. The room went silent. Guzik and Nitti stared at Johnson, apparently shocked that this young black gangster was speaking so directly to Al Capone that he was challenging Capone rather than deferring to him. This was the moment when Johnson would either earn Capone's respect or would get himself killed for disrespecting the most powerful gangster in America. Capone stared at Johnson, and for several long seconds. Then he laughed, a genuine laugh that broke the tension. I like you, Capone said. You got balls coming in here and talking to me like that. Okay, Mr. Johnson, tell me what Harlem's offering, and more importantly, Tell me what Harlem thinks I should get out of this deal, because you're right that fighting over Harlem would be expensive, but you're wrong if you think I can't win that fight, so convince me why I should make a deal instead of just taking what I want. Johnson reached into his jacket pocket, slowly extracted a document, and placed it on the top. Bull. This is detailed financial analysis of what Dutch Schultz and the other white bosses are spending trying to muscle into Harlem's numbers racket. They're spending approximately $50,000 per month on enforcers, on bribes, on the violence they're using to try to force Madame St. Clair and the other Harlem operators out. And after 6 months of this war, what do they have to show for it? They've killed some of our people, we've killed some of theirs, and they still don't control any significant percentage of Harlem's action. Capone picked up the document, scanned it, handed it to Guzik, who studied it more carefully. Now, Johnson continued, imagine instead that you make a deal. Harlem's policy operations generate approximately $20 million annually. That's after overhead, after paying off cops, after all expenses. What if we offered you 20% of that, for $1 million per year, in exchange for you using your influence to keep Dutch Schultz and the other bosses from trying to take over our territory? That's for $1 million. In profit that costs you nothing except telling other white gangsters to stay out of Harlem. Compare that to spending $50,000 per month to fight a war that you might eventually win, but that'll take years and that'll attract federal attention that none of us want. Guzik looked up from the document. He's right about the numbers. All for $1 million a year is more than we're making from most of our operations, and it's clean money. We don't have to do anything except maintain the peace. But there's more, Johnson said. And this was where the proposition became truly extraordinary. Madame St. Clair understands that paying tribute to your organization makes sense. We're not challenging your authority. We're not asking T. O be equal partners. But what we are asking for is autonomy in our territories. You let us run Harlem. You let us run the colored neighborhoods and other cities, and we'll pay you 20% of gross profits annually. That gives you income from territories you're not currently making anything from, gives you influence over colored gangsters across the country, and costs you nothing except preventing other white bosses from starting wars in territories where we're already established. Capone leaned back in his chair, thinking the proposition made business sense. For $1 million annually from Harlem alone, plus percentages from black controlled gambling and numbers operations in other cities, could total 10 to 15 million per year with essentially zero effort or risk on Capone's part. But the social implications were staggering. You know what you're asking, Capone said quietly. You're asking me to make colored gangsters part of the national organization. You're asking me to tell every Italian boss in the country that they have to respect agreements with black criminals, that they can't just take what they want from colored neighborhoods. You're asking me to change how the entire underworld operates. Yes, Johnson said simply, that's exactly what we're asking, and we're willing to pay for it. What happened next was what made this meeting legendary, the twist that would remain secret for decades. That would change both men's lives, and that would alter the structure of American organized crime forever. Capone stood, walked to the window overlooking Michigan Avenue, and was silent for nearly a minute while everyone in the room waited to see whether he'd accept or reject the proposition. Then Capone turned back to face Johnson and said something that shocked everyone in the room. I accept your deal, but not for the reasons you think. I'm not accepting because the money makes sense, though it does. I'm accepting because I've been thinking for months about the same thing you're proposing, and you showing up here tells me that the smartest colored gangsters in the country are thinking the same way I am. And when smart people on different sides of a conflict reach the same conclusion independently, that means the conclusion is probably right. Johnson stared at Capone, not understanding. Here's what I figured out, Capone. He continued, this prohibition thing isn't going to to last forever, maybe 10 more years, maybe less. The government's going to realize they made a mistake. They're going to repeal the 18th Amendment. And when that happens, bootlegging is over. Every organization in the country is going to lose its main source of income, and we're all going to be scrambling to find new rackets to make. At the difference, Capone returned to the table, sat down, and looked directly at Johnson. The future of organized crime isn't bootlegging. It's gambling, it's narcotics, it's labor racketeering. Tease all the stuff that'll still be illegal after Prohibition ends, and you know what I've learned. The colored neighborhoods run the best numbers operations in the country. Harlem's policy game is more sophisticated than anything the Italians are doing. Madame St. Clair and the other colored operators have systems that we could learn from. So what I'm proposing is this. Yes, you pay us 20% and you get autonomy in your territories. But in exchange, I want you to teach our people how you run the numbers. I want technical cooperation where your best operators show our people systems you've developed, because I think 5 years from now, 10 years from now, gambling is going to be the biggest racket in America, and whoever has the best operations is going to dominate. Johnson was stunned. This wasn't just a protection deal. This was Capone proposing actual partnership, proposing knowledge sharing, proposing that black and white gangsters learn from each other rather than just fighting over territory. And here's the second part, Capone said, and he glanced at Guzik and Nitty before continuing. I know you came here expecting that I might agree to let Harlem parody independently, but what you didn't expect is that I've already been having the same conversation with colored gangsters in Detroit, in St. Louis, in Baltimore. They've been reaching out to my people, asking for the same thing you're asking for, autonomy in their territories in exchange for paying tribute. And I've been thinking this is the smart play, that having colored gangsters as part of the organization, not as equals, because the Italians won't accept that, but as autonomous operators who pay tribute and who get protection in exchange, makes more sense than constantly fighting over territories that we don't understand as well as the people who already run them. Johnson struggled to process this. Capone wasn't just accepting Harlem's proposition, he'd apparently been developing his own plan to reorganize American organized crime along racial lines, to create structure where white and black gangsters operated in parallel with defined territories and mutual obligations. So here's my counteroffer. Capone said Harlem pays 15% instead of 20%. I'm reducing the tribute because I want cooperation, not just money. In exchange, Madame St. Clair sends her 3 best numbers operators to Chicago for 3 months to teach my people how she runs her operation. And you, Mr. Johnson, you stay in Chicago as my personal liaison to Harlem. You'll live here, you'll learn how I operate, and you'll be the person who coordinates between my organization and the colored organizations across the country. We're going to build something new here, a national steamer. Where everybody has their territory, where everybody pays their tribute, where everybody respects the agreements, and where we all make more money than we're making fighting each other. The room was silent again. What Capone was proposing was revolutionary. It was the creation of a genuinely integrated, though hierarchical, criminal organization at a time when American society was rigged, idly segregated, when most white people wouldn't even sit at the same table with black people, when the idea of white and black gangsters working together was unthinkable. If I agree to this, Johnson said slowly, if I stay in Chicago and work with you, what happens when people find out? What happens when the Italian bosses in New York hear that Al Capone has a colored gangster working as his liaison? What happens when colored folks in Harlem hear that Bumpy Johnson is working for a white gangster? Capone smiled. That's the beautiful part. Nobody finds out. This arrangement stuff is secret publicly. You're just another guy working In my organization, we don't advertise that you're coordinating with colored gangsters across the country. We don't tell the Italian bosses exactly what our the arrangement is. We just tell them that we've worked out arrangements that stop the wars in colored neighborhoods and that generate income for our organization. And in Harlem, you tell people that you negotiated autonomy, that you got the white bosses to back off, that colored gangsters can operate independently as long as they pay reasonable tribute. Everybody gets to save face. Everybody gets what they want, and the real arrangement stays between us. Johnson looked at Capone, at Guzik, at Nitti, understanding that he was being offered something extraordinary, the chance to help shape national organized crime policy to protect black gangsters across the country from being crushed by white mobs, to build something that could outlast Prohibition and Co. It provides structure for decades. I need to talk to Madame St. Clair, Johnson said. This is bigger than what she sent me here to negotiate. I need her approval before I can to stay in Chicago. Of course, Capone said. Caller will give you privacy, but Mr. Johnson, you tell Madame St. Clair this. Al Capone is offering partnership, not just protection. We're offering to build something together that's bigger than Harlem, bigger than Chicago, something that can make all of us richer and safer than we are now. And you tell her that this offer is good for 1 week. After that, I go back to letting dead Schultz and the others fight over Harlem, and we see who wins because I can wait. I've got time and money, but Harlem doesn't have time, so it's to decide fast. The stakes in the Capone-Johnson negotiation extended far beyond the immediate question of who would control Harlem's gambling operations. At issue was the fundamental structure of American organized crime, whether it would remain fragmented along racial and ethnic lines with constant violence, or whether it could be reorganized into a more stable and more profitable arrangement that acknowledged racial boundaries but created mechanisms for cooperation across those boundaries. The business implications, the financial stakes were enormous. Harlem's policy operations generated approximately $20 million annually in the late 1920s, making the neighborhood's numbers racket more profitable than many legitimate businesses, making it territory worth fighting for, also making it expensive to conquer through violence. The cost of violence was escalating. Dutch Schultz and other white gangsters were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars monthly on the war for Hall. Were losing men, were attracting police attention, and were making minimal progress toward actually controlling the territory. The alternative revenue source that Capone proposed, receiving 15 to 20% of black-controlled gambling operations across the country, could generate 10 to 15 million annually with minimal cost or risk, providing stable income that would continue even after Prohibition time ended. The knowledge transfer about numbers. Operations could improve Italian gangsters' gambling rackets, making them more efficient and more profitable, potentially generating additional millions in revenue from improved operations in Italian-controlled territories. From pure business perspective, Capone's proposal made enormous sense. More money, less violence, more stability, better long-term prospects, but the social implications were staggering. Racial segregation was absolute. In America, most white people refuse even basic social equality with black people, wouldn't eat at the tables, wouldn't use the same facilities, wouldn't accept black people as anything approaching equals in any sphere of life. The criminal underworld reflected this segregation. White gangsters counter all the most profitable rackets, controlled relationships with corrupt politicians and police, control of the national criminal networks, while black gangsters operated in the margins with whatever territory white gangsters didn't want or couldn't effectively control. What Capone was proposing violated these norms, treating black gangsters as autonomous operators worthy of negotiating with, incorporating them into national criminal organization, creating arrangements that acknowledged their effectiveness and the right to control their own territories. The backlash risk was severe if other Italian bosses learned that Capone was making deals with black gangsters, that he was treating them as partners rather than as subordinates to be crushed. They might view Capone as weak, might challenge his leadership, might refuse to honor agreements he'd made. The political risk was equally severe. Politicians who accepted bribes from Italian gangsters might refuse to be corrupted by black gangsters, might view cooperation between white and black criminals as threatening to racial hierarchies, might withdraw their protection if they learned about integrated criminal operations. This meant that the arrangement, if it was to work, had to remain secret, had to be known only to the top leadership of both white and black criminal organizations, had to be maintained through informal understandings rather than through public declarations, had to preserve the appearance of racial segregation even while creating practical cooperation. The negotiation also raised questions about power and subordination. Capone held overwhelming power. He could crush Harlem's operations if he chose to, could direct Dutch Schultz and others to intensify the war, could eventually win through sheer application of resources, even if the victory was expensive. But power isn't the same as profit. Capone recognized that winning might cost more than it was worth, that crushing black gangsters would be Pyrrhic victory if it destroyed the profitability of the territories he conquered. The tribute arrangement created hierarchy. Black gangsters would pay he'd to gangsters for protection and autonomy, establishing clear subordination even while granting practical independence. But subordination can be mutually profitable. Black gangsters would gain security and autonomy they couldn't maintain independently. White gangsters would gain income without effort. Both sides would benefit even though the relationship was unequal. This dynamic subordination, that was mutually beneficial hierarchy, that created stability, then resentment, was what made the Capone-Johnson arrangement potentially sustainable even though it violated social norms. To understand the Capone-Johnson meeting, one must understand the historical context. America, 8 years into Prohibition, at the peak of organized crime's power and wealth, but also at a moment when the violence and chaos of Prohibition were beginning to suggest that new approaches were needed. The 18th Amendment, which prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages, had been in effect, and by its effects were clear. Bootlegging had become an enormous industry. Illegal alcohol sales generated an estimated $3 billion annually across the United States, more than the budget of the federal government, making it the most profitable illegal enterprise in American history to that point. Organized crime had exploded in wealth and power. Gangsters like Al Capone, who controlled bootlegging operations, had become extraordinarily wealthy, had corrupted law enforcement at every level, had become more powerful than many legitimate businesses. Violence had escalated. Gang wars over bootlegging territory had killed thousands of people, had made cities like Chicago, New York, and Detroit terrifyingly violent, had created public demand for law enforcement action that was making it harder for gangsters to operate with impunity. But Prohibition's political support was weakening. Many Americans had concluded that Prohibition was a failure, that it created more problems than it solved, that eventual repeal was likely, even though it might take years. This context meant that smart gangsters like Capone were already thinking about the post-Prohibition future, were already planning for what would happen when bootlegging ended, and when they need alternative revenue sources. American society was rigidly segregated. Legal segregation in the South enforced complete separation of races in schools, public facilities, housing, transportation, and virtually every aspect of life. De facto segregation in the North created neighborhoods that were overwhelmingly white or black, created employment discrimination that relegated black workers to the lowest paying jobs. created social customs that prevented interracial interaction except and subordinate superior relationships. The Harlem Renaissance was at its peak. Harlem was experiencing extraordinary cultural flowering with jazz, literature, art, creating black cultural institutions that white Americans were beginning to notice and appreciate even while maintaining social segregation. Black organized crime existed in major cities. Black neighborhoods ran gambling operations, particularly the numbers policy game, operated speakeasies and brothels, but was generally subordinate to or ignored by white organized crime that controlled the most profitable rackets. This racial context made the idea of partnership between white and black gangsters revolutionary. It violated fundamental assumptions about how racial hierarchies worked, suggested that criminal organizations might be ahead of legitimate society in recognizing that cooperation across racial lines could be profitable. American organized crime was less organized than it would become, ethnic and regional fragmentation. Italian gangs controlled some territories, Irish gangs controlled others. Jewish gangsters operated independently. Polish and other ethnic criminals had their own organizations, creatin' patchwork rather than coordinated. National structure, constant violence. Without national coordination, territorial disputes were resolved through violence, creating instability that harmed everyone's profits and that attracted law enforcement attention. Inefficiency. Without cooperation, bootleggers competed rather than coordinated, drove down prices, created oversupply in some markets, and shortages in others, operated less efficiently than they would have with better organization. The commission that would eventually create national coordination among Italian American organized crime groups didn't yet exist. It would be established after Lucky Luciano eliminated the old-school mustache pets who resisted cooperation with other ethnic groups and who opposed modernization of criminal enterprises. This meant that Capone's proposal to create coordinated arrangements with black gangsters was actually ahead of its time, was proposing the kind of territorial organization and cooperation that the commission would later create among Italian groups, but was extending it across racial lines in ways that the commission never would. After Bumpy Johnson called Stephanie St. Clair from the Lexington Hotel to explain Capone's counter-proposal. After St. Clair considered the offer and gave Johnson authority to accept on Harlem's behalf, the real work of building the arrangement began. Over the next several days, Capone, Johnson, Guzik, and Nitti worked out the detailed structure territory. Black gangsters would have exclusive control over gambling, prostitution, and other rackets in predominantly black neighborhoods across the United States. White gangsters would agree not to compete in these territories, would know to attempt to muscle in on established black operations, would respect the territorial boundaries. Tribute. Black gangsters would pay 15% of gross profits from gambling and numbers operations to Capone's organization, and later after the commission was established to the appropriate Italian family in each city. This tribute would be paid quarterly, would be enforced through the threat at failure to pay would result in loss of protection and in white gangsters being allowed to move into black territories. Protection in exchange for tribute. Capone's organization would prevent their white gangsters from attacking black operations, would use its political connections to ensure that police raids on black gambling operations would be minimal or coordinated in advance to allow operators to avoid arrests, would provide backing if black gangsters face challenges from competitors or from law enforcement. Knowledge sharing. As Capone had proposed, there would be technical cooperation where black numbers operators would teach Italian gangsters the sophisticated systems that had been developed in Harlem, and where both sides would share information about law, enforcement activities, about corrupt officials who could be bribed, about opportunities for expansion, dispute resolution. A mechanism would be created for resolving disputes between black and white gangsters. Bumpy Johnson operating from Chicago, would serve as liaison and arbiter, would coordinate between Capone's organization and black gangsters in various cities, would work to resolve conflicts before they escalated to violence. Secrecy. The arrangement would be kept secret from the public from most members of both black and white criminal organizations and would be known only to top leadership who needed to know in order to enforce the agreements. This structure was sophisticated, more sophisticated than most legitimate business arrangements, and demonstrated that Capone was serious about creating sustainable organization rather than just extracting short-term tribute. Implementing the arrangement faced several major challenges. Convincing other white gangsters. Capone needed to convince Italian bosses in New York, in Detroit, in other major cities that the arrangement made business sense, that respecting black territories and accepting tribute was more profitable than trying to take over those territories through violence. This required Capone to use his prestige and his influence. He was the most successful gangster in America, was widely admired for his business acumen, and could argue credibly that his Chicago operations proved that cooperation was more profitable than constant warfare. Convincing black gangsters. Bumpy Johnson and Stephanie St. Clair needed to convince black operators in other cities that paying tribute to white gangsters was acceptable price for autonomy and protection, that the arrangement would and just be another form of exploitation. This required demonstrating that the arrangement provided real benefits, that police raids decreased, that white gangsters actually stayed out of black territories, that disputes were resolved fairly, that the tribute payments resulted in genuine protection rather than just being extortion. Maintaining secrecy. The arrangement had to remain secret, enough that it wouldn't provoke backlash from white society that would view cooperation between white and black criminals as threatening, but had to be known widely enough within criminal organizations that people would actually follow the rules. This required careful management of information. Top leaders knew the details. Mid-level operators knew only that there were arrangements that needed to be respected. Street-level criminals knew only that certain territories were off limits without understanding why. Preventing defections. Both sides needed to prevent individual gangsters from violating the agreement. White gangsters who thought they could make quick money by muscling into black territories. Black gangsters who thought they could avoid paying tribute and would in fact consequences. This required enforcement mechanisms. Violators would be punished by their own organizations rather than by the other side, preventing violations from escalating into inter-organization. All conflicts through late and into the arrangement was implemented. Bumpy Johnson remained in Chicago for over a year, living in a safe house provided by Capone's organization, meeting regularly with Capone and his advisors, coordinating with black gangsters in New York, Detroit, Baltimore, St. Louis, and other cities. Stephanie St. Clair sent 3 of her best numbers operators to Chicago to teach Capone's people the sophisticated systems Harlem had developed. The betting slips, the pickup systems, the calculation methods, the payout structures that made Harlem's icy games so successful. Tribute payments began. Harlem's operations paid their first quarterly tribute, representing 15% of in-quarterly gross profits. The money was delivered in cash to one of Capone's collectors, was deposited in banks that Capone controlled, was laundered through legitimate businesses. The violence decreased. Dutch Schultz and other white gangsters who'd been fighting for control of Harlem were informed through channels that aren't entirely clear historically, but that apparently involved Capone communicating through New York's Italian bosses that Harlem was now under protection and that attempts to take it over would be viewed as violations of arrangements that Capone had made. Schultz backed off, recognizing that fighting Capone's protected territories wasn't worth the cost. The system expanded. Black gangsters in other cities learned about the Harlem arrangement, reached out to Bumpy Johnson to negotiate similar deals for their territories, and gradually a network of protected black gambling operations was established across major American cities. But the arrangement was functioning smoothly, was generating millions in tribute for Capone, ease organization while providing stability and autonomy for black gangsters, and was demonstrating that cooperation across racial lines could work even in an era of rigid segregation. The capo. Any Johnson arrangement had consequences that neither men anticipated when they made the deal. When Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky created the Commission to organize Italian-American crime families nationally, they adopted elements of the Capone-Johnson model, territorial exclusivity. Each family would control its territory without interference from other families, reducing conflicts and increasing stability, tribute, and sharing. Arrangements, families would share profits from certain operations, would pay percentages for protection or cooperation, creating financial interdependence that discouraged warfare. Dispute resolution mechanisms. The Commission would resolve conflicts between families before they escalated to violence, providing formal structure for what Capone and Johnson had created. Informally, the model that had been developed to manage white-black criminal relationships became the template for organizing white criminal organizations, demonstrating that the innovation had broader applicability than its original purpose. The protection arrangements allowed black gangsters to build more stable and more sophisticated operations. Without constant warfare with white gangsters, black operators could invest in improving their operations, could develop better systems, could accumulate capital that would be used to expand and into legitimate businesses. Numbers operations flourish. By the black-controlled policy, gambling in Harlem on Chicago's South Side in Detroit's black neighborhoods generated tens of millions of dollars annually, much of which stayed in black communities rather than being extracted by white gangsters. Some black gangsters became wealthy. Figures like Stephanie St. Clair, Bumpy Johnson himself, and others accumulated significant wealth that they used to support black businesses, to provide loans that black people couldn't get from white-controlled banks, to create economic infrastructure in black communities. The arrangement that had started as tribute to white gangsters evolved into mechanism that allowed black economic development in areas where legitimate economic opportunities were severely limited by discrimination. Bumpy Johnson's role as liaison between white and black criminal organizations made him one of the most powerful black gangsters in America. He knew both worlds, understood how Italian gangsters operated, understood the concerns and opportunities of black gangsters, could navigate between the two worlds in ways that few other people could. He had Capone's backing, and later, after Capone's imprisonment, had backing from the Commission. This protection made Johnson almost untouchable, gave him authority to resolve disputes, made him essential to maintaining the arrangement. He became mentor. Younger black gangsters learned from Johnson how to operate within the system, how to navigate relationships with white organized crime, how to build operations that were profitable but that didn't threaten the territorial arrangements. When Bumpy Johnson eventually returned to Harlem after Capone's imprisonment, he became one of the most powerful and most respected figures in Harlem's underworld, ruling for decades until his death. His power built fundamentally on the relationship had established with Al Capone. Perhaps most remarkably, the details of the Capone-Johnson arrangement remained secret for decades. Neither man publicized it. Capone never spoke publicly about making deals with black gangsters. Johnson never claimed credit for negotiating the arrangement. Both men understanding that revealing it would harm both sides, the Commission protected the accurate. When the Commission was established, the territorial arrangements with black gangsters were incorporated into the Commission's rules, but the history of how those arrangements developed was not widely discussed. Historians missed it. For decades, organized crime historians focused on Italian-American crime families largely ignored black organized crime and didn't recognize that there had been formal though secret cooperation between white and black criminals dating back to the Prohibition-era. Only recently, as historians have examined black organized crime more carefully, as they've analyzed financial records and interviewed the few surviving participants, has the extent of the Capone-Johnson arrangement become clear, revealing a chapter of American crime history that was deliberately hidden. Al Capone's conviction for tax evasion and his subsequent imprisonment could have destroyed the arrangement, but instead it was absorbed into the comey-science structure. When Capone went to federal prison, Frank Nitti took over the Chicago outfit and maintained the arrangements with black gangsters that Capone had established. Bumpy Johnson continued serving as liaison, but now coordinated with Nitti than with Capone directly. When the commission was established, the territorial arrangements with black gangsters were incorporated into the commission's national organization. Each commission family would collect tribute from black gambling operations in their territories, would provide protection, would rescue the boundaries that had been established. The arrangement proved remarkably durable. Through the end, black gambling operations continued paying tribute to commission families, continued receiving protection, continued operating with substantial autonomy in their territories. Through the end, even as the civil rights movement challenged segregation in legitimate society, the criminal underworld maintained its racial boundaries and its tribute arrangements, demonstrating that criminal organizations can sometimes be more conservative than legitimate society about maintaining established practices. Into the elements of the arrangement persisted, though by then heroin trafficking had largely replaced gambling as the most profitable criminal enterprise, and the dynamics between white and black criminals were shifting as black criminals became more independent and less willing to accept subordinate status. The Capone-Johnson arrangement finally ended not through violence, but through obsolescence, the decline of the commission. By the end, federal prosecutions had severely damaged the commission families, had eliminated most top leadership, had disrupted the national organization that had maintained the territorial arrangements. The rise of independent black criminal organizations by the black gangs involved in crack cocaine trafficking, operated independently, didn't pay tribute to Italian families, didn't respect the old territorial boundaries, represented new generation that had no memory of or loyalty to arrangements made in the Prohibition-era. The changing economics of crime, drug trafficking, was more profitable than gambling had ever been, created opportunities for independent operators who didn't need commission protection, made the old tribute system seem unnecessary and outdated. By the early 21st century, the Capone-Johnson arrangement was a historical artifact remembered only by crime historians and by a few surviving old-timers who lived through the era when Bumpy Johnson and Al Capone had reorganized American organized crime along lines that acknowledged racial realities while creating cooperation that benefited both sides. The story of how Al Capone and Bumpy Johnson negotiated the arrangement that would govern American organized crime for decades reveals several uncomfortable truths about American history. The Capone-Johnson arrangement demonstrated that criminal organizations can be pragmatic about race in ways that legitimate society isn't. When cooperation is profitable, criminals will cooperate across racial lines even when social norms forbid such cooperation. But criminal cooperation still reflects racial hierarchies. The arrangement didn't create equality, created subordination that was less exploitative than alternatives, but that still maintained white gangsters in superior position and black gangsters in subordinate position. This creates complex legacy. On one hand, the arrangement provided black gangsters with autonomy and protection they might not have achieved independently. On the other hand, it institutionalized trace abuse system where black communities gambling revenue was partially extracted by white criminals. The arrangement's secrecy for so many decades demonstrates both sides had incentives to hide the truth. White gangsters didn't want to be seen as cooperating with black criminals. Black gangsters didn't want to be seen as subordinate to white criminals. Both sides benefited from maintaining the fiction that they operated independently. Hidden history is often more interesting than known history. The conventional narrative of American organized crime focused on Italian-American families and largely ignored black organized crime. Missed the cooperative arrangements that actually existed, created simplified story that was easier to tell, but that was incomplete. Truth eventually emerges, even secrets that were protected for decades eventually become known as historians examine new sources. Interview surviving participants piece together the hidden arrangements that shaped history. The arrangement reveals Al Capone as more complex than the simple thug of popular imagination. He was capable of innovation, recognizing that cooperation with black gangsters could be more profitable than conflict required, seeing past social prejudices that most white Americans couldn't see past. He was pragmatic about race. While there is no evidence Capone was particularly white progressive on racial issues, he was willing to treat black gangsters as partners when it served his business interests, suggesting that profit motive could overcome prejudice, at least in criminal contexts. His legacy is more complicated. Capone is remembered primarily for violence and for tax evasion conviction, but his greatest achievement might have been creating organizational structures, including arrangements with black gangsters that brought stability to American organized crime, and that persisted long after his imprisonment. Bumpy Johnson's role reveals him as one of the most important but least known figures in American crime history. He was strategist and diplomat. Negotiating with Capone required courage, but also requires sophistication about how to present Harlem's proposition in ways that would appeal to Capone's business sense. He became bridge between worlds. His years in Chicago learning Capone's operations, his role as liaison coordinating between white and black criminals made him essential to making the arrangement work. His legacy in Harlem, when Johnson returned to Harlem and ruled its underworld for decades, his power was based fundamentally on the relationships he built with white organized crime, on the protection those relationships provided, demonstrating that success in criminal underworld required navigation skills. As much as violence, Al Capone wasn't just a violent thug. He was a businessman who recognized that cooperation could be more profitable than conflict, who was willing to work with black gangsters when doing so served his interests, who created organizational innovations that shaped American crime for generations. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a Harlem gangster. He was a negotiator who secured autonomy for black criminals across America, who built relationships with white organized crime that provided protection and stability, who became one of the most powerful crime figures of the 20th century despite operating in an era of rigid racial segregation. Their secret alliance, negotiated in a hotel dining room in Chicago, reorganized American organized crime in ways that historians are only now beginning to understand, created arrangements that persisted for decades, and demonstrated that when money is at stake, people will find ways to cooperate even across the deep social divides. The twist that Capone had been planning the same reorganization that Harlem proposed, that he saw black gangsters as potential partners rather than just as competitors to be crushed. Head reveals a sophistication about criminal organization that contradicts the simple violence-focused narrative of Prohibition-era crime and the consequences, the stability it created, the wealth it allowed black criminals to accumulate. The organizational model it provided for the commission demonstrate that this secret meeting had impacts that extended far beyond the immediate question of who would control Harlem's gambling